Hello everyone, my name is Monique Pisters. I'm the head of tax of Grant Thornton in the Netherlands, and I welcome you to this new session on EU tax updates. Today I'm joined by Sasha Kerins, who's the head of international tax of Grant Thornton Ireland. And as you might know, Sasha and I frequently update on behalf of the GTIL network, companies and colleagues on EU tax updates. And today we will be talking with you on the new Omnibus Directive on direct taxation. We will be talking a little bit about the scope, the background, and more importantly, of course, what it means for international organizations.
And this isn't really about a new tax, Monique. It's about looking at the existing EU framework from a direct tax perspective and considering how it can be made simpler and more practical for businesses operating within the EU.
What the EU basically is doing is they are drafting a new directive. It's estimated to be issued in June 2026. And the aim is basically to simplify the EU corporate tax rules. So to consolidate certain rules, but also to act as a sort of cleanup exercise for some other rules, which perfectly fits in the agenda of the EU to make the tax legislation a little bit more simplified.
Exactly. And if you think about ATAD, anti-hybrid rules, interest limitation rules, and CFC rules, we've a myriad of legislation introduced across the EU at different times as a result of the BEPS initiatives, but also political pressure, but really not always interacting smoothly from a business perspective.
Yeah, and there's also, of course, a strong political narrative around certainty, but also around competitive, especially in the post-Pillar 2 environment we are currently in.
And I suppose when we think about the directive and think about simplification, the focus is very much on simplifying the administrative burden. Groups are clearly telling policymakers that the compliance across the EU is getting more complex and more costly, with really no impact on the underlying tax position in some cases.
Yeah, true. And that complexity is also often driven by overlapping rules. For instance, domestic anti-abuse legislation, which overlaps the EU legislation and sometimes even goes further than the EU anti-abuse legislation goes.
So the hope really here is that the Omnibus Directive rationalises definitions, impacts thresholds and mechanics to make consistency and more streamlining across the EU, and really making compliance more predictable and less resource intensive. The aim of the directive is to reduce the compliance burden by 25% in most cases, but for SMEs more so at 35%. SMEs operating across Europe are really struggling with the burden, and it's really not aligned with the modern architecture in how some of those businesses are operating at an international scale.
And we can, of course, not talk or have a conversation amongst the two of us without discussing Pillar 2. So many groups are now asking whether the EU will finally acknowledge whether there are some legacy rules which are currently overlapping with the globe. How do you see this?
Well, I think a good example here is the CFC rules.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you've got CFC, Pillar 2, businesses having to look at both systems side by side, and both systems really focusing on low tax jurisdictions. So creating complications with both those systems now in play post Pillar 2.
Yeah. So I guess the key question here is whether Omnibus will actually do something in aligning these two, or whether it is just tweaking around the edges without any real alignments made.
And I think alignment is the key thing here. Yeah. It's not just really about the theory. It's about really making sure that the directive has an impact and in relation to alignment, and is not just ending up in just relabeling some of the existing rules we already have within the existing EU direct tax system.
Yeah, true.
So from an EU perspective, there's a clear competitiveness angle here. You know, they're trying to send a message through the directive that they understand the investment implications and the complexity that the current tax system is creating for businesses.
Yeah, agree. So without rolling back anti-abuse legislation, this omnibus isn't about loosening the rules. It's really all about making the system function better.
And as with everything in tax, we'll have to wait for the draft directive to issue and the detail that's, included in there to really see if it has an impact on streamlining day-to-day operations for global businesses operating across the EU.
So one potential challenge here really is the member state flexibility. Mm-hmm. If I look at it from a Dutch perspective, EU simplification will only work if the Dutch implementation follows suit, basically, the simplification. And the Dutch have always implemented directives very strict, very precise, and even more strict than the directive actually prescribed. So I'm really interested to see whether the Dutch will also ensure that the simplification domestically will also be followed, because otherwise we will still keep fragmentation there, which is a risk.
And I suppose from an Irish member state perspective, certainty is key, both for inbound businesses into Ireland and Irish headquartered businesses with complex global structure. Our existing corporation tax framework in Ireland is pretty coherent. So from an Irish perspective, it's really important that the Omnibus Directive is aligned with that and doesn't try to reinvent any of the existing rules.
Yes, so what businesses should do is watch closely. This is a watch closely moment and not a react immediately moment, I would say.
Yeah, agreed, Monique. I think groups really need to consider the impact that the directive may have on current processes and the burdens around that, and maybe how they're able to realign some of those processes internally and streamline them from a delivery and compliance perspective.
Yeah, agree. And also it's really important for businesses to engage early, to let their voice be heard through consultations, through representative bodies or informal consultation moments. For businesses to make clear where they are struggling, where they are facing with definitions which are unclear, overlapping rules, because the goal here is really to have the compliance obligations of businesses be less burdensome. So really a shout out to all the businesses. Ensure your voice, your struggles are heard when that opportunity arises.
Totally agree. I think the business voice is really important here. Once we have the detail of the draft directive and what's in it, understanding that and giving feedback to the EU. This is obviously going to have to be debated at a member state level, considered and then voted upon. So we really want something that's going to really achieve the aims that they're setting out to achieve at the very outset.
So to summarize, the omnibus proposal isn't about new taxes. It's about the EU tax system and how we can make it function better going forward.
And if it achieves genuine simplification, I think it will be a real win. If it doesn't, it'll be a missed opportunity and potentially impact the competitiveness of EU going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We will, of course, closely monitor the development of the new omnibus proposal. And in June, when it's issued, we will, of course, get back to you with further information and clarification. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us today in our Rotterdam office. And to our viewers, if you have any questions, feel free to pop Sasha or myself a question. Till next time.